everybody. So some of you have copies of the practice vision in front of you, and that's fine. And if you don't, that's also okay. We're going to talk indirectly today. So now we've had an introduction to Sanshin's practice vision overall. We've talked about the sort of basic elements of that. So now I want to start moving us toward talking about what's happening in 2025. So our theme for the year 2025 is something I'm calling tangible thusness. So this follows on the 2024 theme of lineage and legacy. We organized our thinking around the main teachings, the main practice points that we've inherited from our 20th century ancestors. So this kind of gave us a chance to step back, regroup, kind of think about, talk about what was Sawaki Roshi doing, what was Uchiyama Roshi doing, what was Soto Zen doing, what are we doing now in this particular Dharma family. So of course those are based on teachings and practice that go all the way back to Shakyamuni. There's a very clear through line. In no way is it separate from that. These really aren't new inventions. So these themes, these practice points are not really new inventions, but they are useful ways to talk about, summarize, sort of bear in mind what we're doing in this Dharma family. Taken together, they outline a particular approach to practice, and we need to understand what that approach is, what those main points are, so we have a framework, right? We have some kind of structure to our practice. So Sawaki Roshi was one of the driving forces of the 20th century nyoho movement. So one of the things we know about him in looking at what was he teaching, he was very heavily involved in this 20th century nyoho movement. So nyoho are robes that are made according to the dharma of thusness. So all of these things, right? Raksu, okesa. Guidelines for that robe sewing practice go all the way back to the Vinaya. They go all the way back to some of the very earliest Buddhist texts. So again, Sawaki Roshi's not making this up, right? He and the folks involved in this. So as I've mentioned previously, this tradition says there are three faces of nyoho: food, clothing, and shelter. So these are three ways in which we could say we give shape to the Dharma. These are three ways in which there's sort of some form, right, to the Dharma. So yes, everything is already not separate from the Dharma. Yes, everything is already expressing Dharma, completely manifesting Dharma, awakening. But these things that we encounter every day are really huge Dharma gates for us in encountering that, in understanding it, right, experiencing that. So Dharma isn't something that's grandiose out there. Not some big sort of abstract thing that's separate from us. It's right here in food, clothing, and shelter, and things that we encounter every day. So everyone eats food, everyone wears clothes, everyone lives in or functions in some kind of building, some kind of shelter, right? So this is very concrete, everyday, practical stuff. So we will get into the details of food, clothing, and shelter, or we will start to next week. Today I want to talk about nyoho in general. In general, what does it mean to approach our lives from the standpoint of this dharma of thusness? So the kanji for nyo can also be pronounced gotoshi in everyday Japanese. So this means like or in accordance with. It can also mean the same as. So that's an important distinction, an important thing we're going to come back to shortly, right? So nyo in accordance with, and ho is dharma. Ho is in hoko, right? Nyoho is something consistent with, or we could even say the same as dharma. So the opposite, funyo. Fu makes the word negative, right? So funyo, something that's out of step with the dharma. Something has gone amiss. Something has gone awry. There's some kind of dissonance, tension. Something is not lined up. What comes out of that? Suffering, generally, right? So the central question of nyoho, does this thing, whatever this thing is, does this thing create attachment, clinging, desire? That's the central question of nyoho. So there's lots of things we will talk about. Dharma of thusness sounds very kind of up here, right? The central question we're always coming back to is, does this thing create attachment? So as we know, grasping and clinging are the root causes of suffering. So this is really basic stuff. We can see that embracing nyoho really gets to the heart of our practice. So because we may associate it with exotic looking robes and formal meals and chanting in Japanese and all of those things, it can seem like something extra. Here comes Hoko slapping something extra on top of our very simple practice, right? And in fact, of course, it's exactly the opposite. So last week we talked about ritual, how our particular approach to ritual was really a lot about nothing extra. not adding anything extra. Nyoho is really radically nothing extra. In that way, it's not different, right? This is not something we layer over our practice. It's about sort of seeing all the way to the bottom, seeing everything as it really, really is. So if nyoho is really radically nothing extra, then it's certainly consistent, right, with our style of practice, where we're very much about not adding extra, not doing extra. So one important element of a nyoho approach is reusing what exists, reusing what we already have. So rather than making or acquiring a shiny new thing, first we look around to see if we can use something we have or use what we have. So one way that shows up in our practice is that when we have a practice question to resolve, we can start by looking at the existing tradition. We don't have to think we're out here without a lifeline, which we can sometimes in North America, right? We can look to the existing tradition and say, what's the precedent? So what does nothing extra mean in our modern North American practice? We don't have to thrash around trying to make something up, create something new in order to explain our practice, in order to make it relevant. When has it ever not been relevant, right? Simply embodying nyoho puts us right there. So what does a nyoho approach look like when it's on the ground? This not exotic everyday thing. Well, I've mentioned previously, I think there are 3 aspects to a nyoho approach: tai, shiki, and ryo. So this is materials, color, and amount. So if we're making something, acquiring something, buying something, materials, color, and amount. So those are most often applied to food, clothing, and shelter. But before we do that, I think we need to understand them more broadly, because these are really, they can be quite large teachings. They seem very concrete and very specific, and actually there's some other really interesting stuff going on. So tai, materials, using what's appropriate, using something that's not going to cause suffering. So generally that's materials that are unpretentious, fit for purpose, right, appropriate for what we're using them for. Often local, something which is grown local or created locally, so it fits here. I think this part about using what's appropriate and isn't going to cause suffering is interesting. This brings us right back to, is this going to create attachment? But also, in this world of sustainability and larger sort of ecological systems, are we creating some larger suffering here? So the kanji here usually means body or physical form, right? What materials are we using? What physical form are we taking? Japanese karada. In the sense here, though, is like shape, form, substance. So it can also mean posture. If we're thinking body, for instance, it can also mean posture. So I immediately think not only of Zazen, but what about deportment? What about forms? What about ritual? And we can see right away, look at how big this can get. What are we doing with this body? What form are we taking? What are we using to create what we're doing in this moment, including this, right? So how are we embodying? How are we giving shape to the Dharma? What an interesting question, right? Next we have shiki, or color. Again, using colors that don't cause attachment, or using colors that don't cause suffering, which is, how do we think about that? So we sometimes think of these as broken colors. The things that are nyoho are broken colors, so not clear primary colors, not white or black, not something that's flashy, right? There are historical reasons for some of that, like particular dyes were expensive, right? So you avoided doing something which was going to take a lot of resources. So these colors are something indistinct. These colors are something muddy, right? Something not flashy. So for instance, black, this is always a source of discussion. Black is technically not a nyoho color. And yet look at all the black, right? Historically, a truly black dye was expensive. That was fancy stuff, right? So robes weren't black. They were a very dark blue or a rusty brown. They were not a clear, perfect black. And yet today, of course, we associate black with Zen practice in so many ways. Because for us, this dye thing isn't an issue, right? It's not a problem. So this is always something that comes up. We say nyoho, black is not a nyoho color, and then people look around and go, what? Right? So we need to understand what's underneath that, right? The teaching underneath that is don't use something that takes resources, creates attachment, elevates you in some way. So if you're a really hardcore nyoho practitioner, you don't do black, and yet the Soto Zen is black. So it's just one of the many differences of opinion between nyoho folks and standard Soto folks. And that is a long-term discussion. So shiki, or color, can also mean tone, atmosphere, personality. How does this thing feel, right? So again, nyoho applies to more than a concrete object with a visible color. However, this is also the kanji we use for rupa, as in namarupa, name and form. Right now we can really have a big discussion. So of course we encounter namarupa in the most basic Buddhist teachings. This is the form element of the 5 skandhas, right? Form, feeling, perception, formation, consciousness. This is the form element. It's at the beginning of the 12-fold chain of causation, where we give things names and we decide what they mean for us. Is this good, bad, indifferent, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? What's my relationship to this thing? We make these things objects of our thinking, and now we're off to the races. So this really gets down to the very, very most basic teachings of Shakyamuni. So are we encountering things and seeing their color simply because our eyes are interpreting a certain kind of wavelength of light in a certain way? Or are we immediately deciding this thing is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, adding some extra tone, adding some extra quality, right? In addition to just what color is this, what's my feeling about it? So the last one is ryo, amount. This points us to the first 2 elements of Dogen's Hachidainen-gaku, or 8 awarenesses of great beings, right? Shoyoku, having few desires. Chisoku, knowing satisfaction. So having enough doesn't mean we're depriving ourselves of the things we need. This is not about martyrdom. Martyrdom is an ego trip. Martyrdom means I have some idea about who I am and what my practice means in writing a story. So it's not about that. If we have the means to live comfortably and we can do that in a wholesome way, that's fine. That amount is okay. The problem, of course, is starting to chase after more and more and more stuff, thinking that that chasing and those things are going to end our suffering. Right? What is an appropriate amount? So also we have to think about what having more than our share may mean for others who are going without because we have more than our share. So when we take more food or more land or more attention or more resources or more opportunities than we should, what does that do to the rest of this network of interdependent origination? So under nyoho, when we think about ryo, or amount or size, there's a kind of an expanding scale. So we start with the individual, right? So these robes are made to chu size. When we start making a robe, we measure this, and that's the basis for the calculation for all the panels. So my robe doesn't fit somebody else, right? My robe would drown Esho. Her robe would not fit me, right? So it's very much about what does this individual, what amount does this individual need? We calculate that every time for every person. There isn't a standard like that. At meals, we take as much as we need, but we don't take more than that. One of my problems in Japan and sometimes here, when we get to the formal meals during Sanshin, and we always serve each other. There's a part of this practice which says we should always have some opportunity to serve each other. So we hand each other our bowls across the table and go get food. One of my problems is when I'm sitting across from a healthy young person dishing out food, I get twice what I want. Because they're hungry and the food is good, and they load up for themselves and they'll load up for me. So I often have to say, give me half what you would take for yourself. This used to happen to me in Japan too. I would, if the food was already served, if the rice was already served, I'd get to the table and the first thing I would do is take my bowl and take out half and put it back, which is surprising just given how large I am, right? So we take what we need, but we don't take more. They're giving me what they themselves would want, and we have to look around and say, is that appropriate? So after the individual, then we size things according to the group. How much space does this sangha need in order to function? Or how much tea do we need to feed everybody after the talk, right? How many people are here? Tenzo, of course, has to think about this a lot. How much food am I cooking for the number of people who are sitting in the zendo? And Dogen talks about this. You've got to visualize all the people in the zendo, the people who may be out of the zendo doing work, and all the people in the infirmary. How much food are you cooking, right? For this group. Then maybe we expand another step and we think about nature. We think about the whole network of interdependent origination. How much contamination can nature take before it starts to break down? How much warming can the ocean take on before it changes our weather, right? We can think in an expanding scale. And in each of those cases, we have to know what's the basis of that scale. What's the amount according to what are we looking at? The individual, the group, the community, the society, the planet. So next week, again, we'll look at the specifics of materials, color, and amount as they relate to the three faces of nyoho. But for now, let's take those broader elements, apply them to some concrete objects in general. Let's see how this thing works. So one thing you notice immediately about an object that's based in nyoho, it's unpretentious, it's unassuming. These things are usually sort of muted. They don't stand out. They're not flashy, shiny. They don't call attention to themselves. That doesn't mean they're not made or used with an extremely high degree of skill. It doesn't mean someone was sloppy when they made it. It doesn't mean someone didn't care about how they were using it. This thing itself, made according to Thusness, used according to Thusness, is just sort of unpretentious. So I've been talking lately about the practice of being completely silent within Sanshin and how that is, and I'm sort of discovering this again in my own practice, how this is really about more than we're simply not talking. We're not chitty-chatting, right? Because we know one of the things Uchiyama Roshi thought was important about this style of Sanshin, absolutely no talking. And then I think we take that larger to say, be as nonverbal as we can be. And then I'm even going one sort of outer ring larger and saying, let's think about being completely silent during Sanshin. What am I doing with this body? How am I moving through space? How am I handling things? Because it's when we stop paying attention to that stuff that we start making avoidable noise. Am I rattling my chopsticks on my bowl? Am I walking heavily in the zendo? If I'm taking off my coat, am I doing that with a lot of rustling? Right? It's a wonderful practice to move through this place being as silent as you can be, like there's babies sleeping next to you. Right? You really pay attention to what you're doing. So I think the muted nature of nyoho objects might kind of be the same, approach. There's nothing extra, but there's nothing left out. So we're not in Sanshin, we're not doing things in order to be silent, we're doing everything we need to do. And this nyoho object is being everything it needs to be, and yet it's nothing more, it's nothing extra. It's not making avoidable, unnecessary noise. So this thing, whatever it is, might look kind of shabby, but it's not proud of looking shabby, because now we fall over into another whole story writing session that says, isn't this a wonderful thing because it's shabby? That would be extra. So in the Zuimonki, Dogen frequently mentions the importance of being poor, the importance of practicing poverty. He's speaking, of course, in that case, to an ordained Sangha. You know, you people have left home, you're wearing robes, and you have a bowl, and that's enough. But I think we can certainly take on board the reminders about non-attachment and not grasping, and the challenge is to have a modest life and then not be attached to who we think that life makes us. We can get really holier than thou, right? I'm going to be the best Buddhist practitioner I can be, and I'm going to, practice non-attachment, and I'm not going to have things, but then I'm going to lord that over everybody else and make myself, a wonder. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, we've just gone off the rails. So Sawaki Roshi used to say, and I love this, that every good act is a bad act. What a great reminder. Every good act is a bad act. Every time we're doing something we label as good, we're creating delusion, we're creating attachment, we're creating ideas. Every good act is a bad act. We just act, right? What's appropriate in this moment? What's the wholesome thing to do? I don't need to have an opinion about that. So we just do, in accordance with dharma, again, right? Without some idea. Here we're back to nyoho. So nyoho doesn't look for any reward, whether that's recognition or wealth or whatever that might be. We make our robes out of cut up pieces of what used to be cast off cloth, historically, right? In order that these things are not worth any money. Nobody wants to steal this from me and sell it, It's not worth anything. So it doesn't create any desire, it doesn't create any attachment, so in that way we're kind of safe. Now we also know we can get very, very attached to these things, right? So, we frequently do become proud of these humble robes that used to be made of rags, Look how well I sewed this, or how well I didn't sew this. Look what a nice broken color this is. Look at now how I'm a member of the in crowd because I have this rakusu or robe or something, right? Yikes. We've gone completely off the rails. We've probably convinced ourselves that our pride is really about our devotion to Buddha. I'm such a good practitioner that this robe has to be perfect because this is Buddha's robe, and what does this make me if it's not? I need to make sure this robe is everything it needs to be. Yes, that's good, and probably there's a little piece in there that says, and also, what will people think of me? So we really have to be careful about virtue signaling, humble bragging, and all the things we can get caught up in this practice of nyoho, because all that stuff is extra. So we can turn our virtues into real hindrances. Look how wonderful I am because I'm so humble. So appreciating something in a selfless way can turn into attachment, right? Isn't this old shabby thing beautiful because of all the time and wear and use and everything that it's had, and it's still here, and on that basis I really want this thing because it says something about me. That could be a teacup, that could be a raksu, that could be anything. So another important characteristic of nyoho items, they're made from what we actually have. So rather than trying to go out and find some exotic materials, we use what's readily available. So during Sanshin, we often eat what we grew in the garden. Well, Sangha members, grew in the garden, right? Rather than driving around town looking for a lot of specialty food, exotic specialty stuff. Whenever we can, we put wildflowers on the altar. When those are in season, things that grew in the yard, rather than going out and finding exotic fancy flowers. When we need to make the han, Jeff had to go, but when we needed to make that han, Jeff came up with a chunk of poplar, a local chunk of poplar. We had a local sign artist write that verse and write it in English so we could actually read it, right? Making use of what we have that's here. So what this means in terms of space is that space follows function and function follows space. So we create a space that enables the practice activities that we value, the things we aspire to do as a community, the things we want to carry out here. And also, we adapt the practice to fit the space we have. And we see this all the time in North America, right? Most of us are not practicing in regulation Sotoshu temples. We are in old houses. We are in storefronts. I've seen converted garages, right? We're using the space we have. So the space follows function, and function follows space. So there are plenty of small sanghas that would say, for instance, we can't carry out Sanshin here. We don't have the space. We have to either go somewhere else or fold in with somebody else's sangha. Great, that's one thing Sanshin can help with. Please come here and do Sanshin, right? But, we use what we have and adapt to what we have. So in order to practice this way, we have to give up clinging to ideas about what our practice needs to look like. Yes, we respect the Vinaya, we respect the guidelines, we pull out the ceremony books, we look to precedent, we wholeheartedly do what our ancestors are asking us to do, and yet we also have to bear in mind what's appropriate here, in this space, for these people, in this time. We do what's appropriate and we don't lose the spirit. So this aspect of nyoho, using what we actually have here and now, has to be balanced with this other element, honoring and connecting with our past. That's a big piece of nyoho, honoring and connecting with our past. So this element itself has two aspects, I think. We're using what we can and looking to precedent. So rag robes, a prime example of reusing what we can. So is our dinner practice during Sanshin. Tenzo looks over the leftovers of the day, puts everything into a casserole dish, or puts everything into a soup pot, right? And we have leftovers for dinner, and that's a fairly traditional approach. You could even say that composting the kitchen scraps and turning that into more vegetables is reusing, right? That same wheel is turning. So reduce, reuse, recycle, not new in the world of Buddhist practice. That might feel like a very contemporary kind of catchphrasey thing. That's been around in Buddhist practice for, for centuries. This is basic sustainability. It feels very modern, very forward-thinking, but our ancestors got there first. How? By looking around and saying, this is the way the universe functions, right? This is the way the dharma works. This is what's in accord with the dharma. Which brings us to the second element of this honoring and maintaining our connection with the past, looking to precedent. So I mentioned last week when we have a practice problem to solve, a sangha need that we have to meet, usually we can look at the rest of the tradition for a solution. So human needs don't change that much over time, right? A human community practicing some kind of spiritual practice has some certain basic needs. Those don't change all that much, basically, right, over time. We're probably not the first ones to encounter whatever the question is that's in front of us. Often our ancestors had to solve it first. Maybe in a slightly different circumstance, but there was a human need there, right? So we can learn from what they did rather than thinking, well, we have to start from scratch, or that whatever they did doesn't apply. So when in doubt, we can look to the source. And I find that really reassuring. We may have to adapt, we may have to change, we may have to make some new things. But, in adapting to our own karmic circumstances, we can still use that context, and that context might be really, really important for our understanding. So there's a pattern here, I think, about things being reused, handed down, handed off, making some connection across time and space with others who practice. So there's something pretty cool, I think, about using something that saw a lot of practice before it got to us. We also have such important themes about this from Dogen, about authentic transmission, right? Something got handed down from Shakyamuni. Something got reused. Something got not repurposed, but it's still alive because it's being handed down. So there's something really, when you walk into an 800-year-old temple in Japan, there's something about being in that space and thinking about all the practitioners that were there before us over those 800 or something years. You can smell the incense, it's like embedded in the wood. How many bows happened there? How many hours of zazen happened in the Soto, right? There's something really, you're stepping into something which has been handed down. So we can really see this through line from the 7 Buddhas before Buddha, through Shakyamuni, through, Dogen, Sawaki Roshi, our 20th century ancestors, down to us. So those lines and threads and connections in my mind are what's holding this tradition together. They're what hold us together as a sangha that carries that tradition. This is why I think it's really important for us to understand, what did we inherit from our 20th century ancestors? And then where did that come from, right? What are we carrying? So when we decide to take precepts in some form and we sew Rakusu or Okesa, we don't just finish that sewing project and then immediately put it on and start wearing it, right? There's a process. First, we give it to a teacher who adds something to it by writing on the back, writing a verse, a dedication, a date, a dharma name, dare we say. Then that teacher gives it back to us in some kind of formal way. So something is being handed down. You've made something, you've handed it to a teacher who adds a little something and hands it back. Something is being handed down. Precepts, robe, lineage, dharma, right? Something's being handed down. Then the next day, after that precept ceremony, we arrive for zazen, and again, we don't take that robe out of this case and just throw it on. What do? We put it on our heads, and we chant a verse, which means we're receiving it all over again. And we're giving something back called aspiration or respect or sincerity or something, right? So every time we put on that robe, we're receiving something and upholding something in return. That's a really interesting way to approach our daily practice. You don't just get this robe once. Every time, every day you put it on, you're receiving it again, and you're giving something back. So now we have some humble nyoho item, whatever that may be, something unpretentious, made from what we actually have. It has some connections to things that have gone before it. Possibly it's made of reused materials. It doesn't represent more than is necessary, so that might be a cup, a building, a robe, a ceremony, anything. It doesn't seem like much. But with the eyes of nyoho, we can see this is Buddha's cup. This is Buddha's robe. This is Buddha's building, whatever that is, right? So there's only one of these things, and this is it. There's only one. It's a complete expression of everything, right? So it's not one cup in a group of cups. It is the only cup. It's not one robe in a group of people wearing a robe. It is the robe. It is Buddha's robe, right? So just like each person is a complete expression of Buddha nature or awakening, even though we're all karmically different shapes, sizes, backgrounds, experience, we all have different karmic circumstances, we're also not separate from anything else. There is only one being, right? So this is what Uchiyama Roshi means when he says, everything I encounter is my life. Everything I encounter is just, there's only one thing, because where is it separate from anything else, right? So, my ugly old cup. Here's this one cup, right? It's the only cup, right? This room is the only room. There's nothing separate from here. It's a whole new way to think about Ryo. So it's not just, am I taking too much rice? Here's my bowl. It's the only bowl. There's nothing other than that. So Ryo is infinite, and also, if you open up the kitchen cupboard, there's a bunch of mismatched cups. We can't, in a way, there isn't only one cup. There's a whole bunch of mismatched cups, and yet every one of those cups is the only cup. It's a really interesting Dharma teaching. So when a new person comes to Sanshin and says, "Where's the bathroom?" The Zendo isn't the only room in the building. There's a bathroom, there's a kitchen, there's a common room, and yet this Zendo is the whole universe. This room is the only room, or the bathroom is the only room. So looking for nyoho Dharma gates, making use of them to investigate this practice, that's what's making the Dharma tangible. That's our tangible thusness, right? That's why I'm calling this 2025 theme in this way. So we can take care of food, clothing, and shelter this way, use that opportunity to see how these more abstract teachings reflect the real world, or actually are this concrete real world. So the point of this thing is to bring these things back together. They were never separate, but we can imagine we have lots of abstract teachings, and what does that mean? So this is our opportunity to say, this is it. Here's the Dharma. That's all of it. So nyoho practice is a chance to learn and experience with the body. And really, if our understanding just sort of stays trapped here, well, I'm going to think about, abstract Dogen themes, then it's not a complete understanding. If we're not learning, experiencing, practicing, embodying concretely, something is missing. And this is our opportunity to really be intentional about that. So we can use our encounters with physical objects to deepen our understanding. We can also use the body then to express that understanding in the world. So this is another turning wheel. What am I learning with this body? And then what am I expressing in the world, right? What am I learning through concrete objects? And then what are they expressing in the world? So Echu Kyumo was a 20th century scholar of nyoho robes. He wrote a famous book called Keisa no Kenkyu, or Study of the Okesa, which came out in 1967. So this is 20th century. This is not medieval. We'll hear more about that book next week, and probably throughout the year, next year. So although he's mainly talking about robes, I think what he says about nyoho in general and objects made by nyoho is interesting. Material, color, and size are all essentially components of not arousing desire, separating from fame and fortune. Clearly, a kesa isn't intended to satisfy our thirst for status. If a kesa does fulfill that human part of us that wants status, then perhaps something is actually wrong in the material, in the color or the size. Or it may be that something is wrong with how we're seeing the kesa. So the virtues of the kesa are completely distinct from how we ordinarily think about worldly virtues. Rather, when we speak of the virtues of the kesa, we're speaking of something that doesn't satisfy our expectations, either spiritually or materially. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't satisfy our expectations. It's a virtue that brings no reward. What then is a virtue with no reward? This profitless virtue is the essence of both the kesa and the Buddha Dharma itself. This virtue of the kesa that in no way satisfies the desire for status has a functioning that is both boundless and infinitely unfathomable. Through it, the true value of the kesa and of the Buddha Dharma is revealed. So we can apply what he's saying to our entire practice life, right? Whether we wear robes or not. He's talking about something which is much bigger than simply the okesa. How can we acquire and use and give up things not based on our thirst for status? So of course that requires understanding the nature of self, the impermanence of the five skandhas, and how five skandhas attach to five skandhas. If you want to understand that, please join us on Wednesday evenings, for our discussion of structure of the self in Mahayana, which Todo-san wrote, because it gets right to the heart of that stuff. So Kyumo Roshi says, if objects fulfill our desire for status, then something's wrong with the components of that thing, right? Materials, color, amount. Something is amiss, something has gone awry. Or else the problem is, how am I seeing this nyoho thing and thinking about it? So where's the problem? How we created it or how we're approaching it? And it could be maybe either way. Is there one answer for that? Of course not. My favorite color might be a color you hate. So, there's no attachment for you and there's a lot of attachment for me. So virtues of a nyoho object have nothing to do with what we want from it. So they're virtues with no reward, profitless virtues. That frees this nyoho object then to be boundless and to be one with Dharma. And this is why the real Buddha robe fits everyone, why the Oryoki bowl can hold an infinite amount, why there's space in Vimalakirti's sick room for all the myriad beings that were in there with him, right? And yet that was supposed to be a room, a sick room. So once we stop grasping things, we set them free. Isn't that interesting? We not only set ourselves free, but we set these things free to be what they really are, and not something that's here to manage to satisfy my expectation. So we've set ourselves free because we've removed sort of the artificial constraints that we're putting on whatever this object is. It has to be like this so that it matches my desire. And it's now free to be exactly what it is. So it's not bound by our expectations, by our needs, by how we see that relationship. So if we can do that with a cup, imagine doing that with human beings, right? If we can practice that way with robes and bowls and temples and objects, can we also learn to practice that way with family, friends, Sangha members, people we don't like very much, people we love dearly? So with difficult situations, with questions of discernment, with life and death, can we approach all of those things in that same way? We're going to set them free by not constraining them within our own stories, our own expectations. So most of us come to practice with a particular question we're trying to resolve. We may not be able to articulate it when we arrive, but looking back, we go, oh, that's what got me in the door. Sometimes that leads to our personal vows, which we may write down and sort of enshrine, or maybe we just have an intention, have a personal intention. Many of you know that my question when I came to practice was, how do I make good decisions? How do we make skillful decisions? There must be something to base that on which is not my personal opinion. That doesn't seem like a good foundation. So like, what do I use? There had to be something better. Because my understanding is limited, right? I can't see everything, so small choices and large choices, like what's the basis for that? So nyoho practice helps me answer that question by stripping it down to, does this thing create attachment? Does this thing create desire, clinging, suffering? Oh, well, now I have a way to begin to sort through my options. Does this action create suffering in the world, or does this action liberate me and objects and other people from suffering? So I'm hoping that in 2025, we can really dig into what nyoho is about and have some really interesting, meaningful discussions and explorations. I certainly don't have all the answers. I'm learning just by immersing myself in it. And I think everybody's experience of it is valuable and different, and there's something we can all contribute. So I really am hoping this is a Sangha exploration of this thing. And look at all the many, many, many Dharma gates that are included here, right? Like, pick your favorite, man. There's a way into this thing, which might be about food, clothing, and shelter, and it might be about ritual, and it might be about poetry, and it might be about, I don't know, whatever. So I'm hoping this time next year, we look back and say, we've created an interesting body of material, which is about our understanding and things we've made and things we've discussed, and just lots of stuff to chew on, right? So I'm hoping we kind of, I guess where I'm going with that is, this is not Hoko's project, right? I really hope that as a community, we kind of take on some of this stuff and practice together and investigate together, because I think that's what's going to make it interesting and useful. I want to see what's in here for everybody else, right? I want to see what other people bring into the conversation. So nyoho, not one more thing to layer on top of everything we're already doing. This is not an extra sort of workload, right? This is what gets us, I think, to the heart of our practice. So I don't have a clock. I don't know what time it is, but I'm going to stop there. And then see what folks would like to say. I'm going to start with folks in the room as usual, and then go to the folks at home. Of all of that stuff, what comes up for people? Questions, reflections, ideas, comments?
You got your hand up?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. Kind of.
Well, I have a feeling like a lot of the questions that anybody's going to ask might be answered like within the next year, so.
That's fine, because, you know, it's good to throw the questions out so that, so that we see them in front of us. So what questions come up for you? I think that's also a valuable part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think attachment is something that I've always I'm a very sentimental person, especially like towards objects, and I'm curious to see how it kind of relates to art and like what you create, and maybe like even like the materials that I use to create something, because I become very attached to like a certain brush or oil pastels or something.
Sure. So then I think you get the opportunity to investigate the nature of that attachment. Is that attachment about building a self-image? Or is that attachment about I have good memories of that thing? Or I associate that with somebody that I like? Or, right? There's lots of ways to look at attachment. So it's not that we have to throw out all of our attachments, that all of it is evil. We have to recognize it when it comes up, and we have to see what we're doing with it and how it's affecting the rest of our choices. Like, this is my brush and you can't ever have it, and it's mine. I don't think these teachings are saying we need to stop having nice memories of things, or that we need to stop enjoying things. If I have some attachment to, like this, actually a friend of mine gave me this, so there's something there about that for me. But when it's time for this thing to move on, what am I doing with that moment, right? Or am I guarding this thing? This is my precious, it makes me who I am. Am I making bad choices about that, right? So attachment, of course, it's so basic in our practice, we spend our whole lives delving into the nature of that. So I'm never going to tell you have to give up your favorite brush and your oil pastels because you feel some connection to them. It's a dharma gate for you, though, and you get to look at it and say, what is the nature of that attachment? And then, is it causing me to behave in some way which is unskillful? Is it creating suffering for me? I have tools I like too. Don't take my chisels. Don't take my carbide tip chisels and make me grind my own the old-fashioned way, because I'm rubbish at that, right? So we've all got preferences. We've all got things we like. But we do get to sort of dig into where those come from and how they're influencing what we do with this body and mind, right? So, all of those are live questions, and they're going to come up. So Raksu, we were talking about that on Thursday night, right? So Raksu, and it's all right there. all of your ego stuff is like right there. So I think we do have folks in this Sangha who make things, whether that's physically making objects or people who write or paint or something. All of that creation, we get to sort of look at that process. I'm never going to say we shouldn't be doing those things. We should absolutely be doing those things. But then, how can we investigate the subtleties of that practice? Yeah? Other things?
Tell a very short story about something that happened to me years ago that was a major paradigm shift for me. It was relevant to what we're talking about. So many years ago, I was a hospice volunteer. And one of the things I did in that capacity is I was a camp counselor for youth who've lost significant others. And that was very much of a challenge of helping bereavement for youngsters. And I remember there was this one young man, I think he was like 14, who somehow clung to me in a way that seemed very odd. And particularly whenever a social worker was around. He would kind of hide himself behind me as if throw up a shield against the social workers. So I went through the file and said, well, what's up with this person? What's going on here? And so what he experienced was a murder-suicide where his father shot his mother.
Golly.
In his presence.
Golly.
He witnessed this. And it still breaks my heart when I think of this. So I'm reading this, and my first reaction is, oh my God, this person is really traumatized. And my second reaction was, I want to insulate myself from these feelings. And then something else said, no. Because if I insulated myself from these feelings, I would dehumanize the situation. And it would be better for me to participate in the sorrows of this individual than to become unattached to it. So the paradigm shift there is the voluntary participation in the sorrows of the world. That is, it's not enough to recognize that attachments create suffering. There's also the bodhisattva who doesn't try to escape suffering, but go right into the heart of it. And that's a different paradigm for me. That was a big shift. The simplistic idea of just simply getting rid of attachments just fell to the ground. I don't think that is the goal of the Bodhisattva.
Right.
But it is an acknowledgement that attachments do create suffering. But sometimes it's better to suffer than not to suffer, if you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, because if you choose not to suffer in a way, you're not seeing the entire picture, right? I mean, we can't cut off some part of our life. We can't cut off some part of the Buddha way, right? So how do we completely, as Avalokiteshvara, how do we completely enter into the sufferings of the world and yet not do that in a way which is about our own self-clinging, about our ideas about who we are, right? Because as soon as we create that kind of separation, then bodhisattva work becomes pretty well impossible, right? So we can't be overwhelmed by that, and yet we also can't separate ourselves from that. So, how does Jizo go into hell? That's kind of what we're doing, right? So how do we how do we remain open to the suffering of the world, recognizing the suffering of the world, hearing the cries of the world, and yet not get overwhelmed by that? And that's another whole Dharma talk, which I've given, several other places, because that's a live question for us. So these teachings are not about negating our attachment, ignoring our attachment, labeling our attachment as evil, because in these karmic circumstances, attachments are going to arise. We have karmic bodies and minds, right? Stuff's going to happen. So our skill as bodhisattvas is how do we navigate that and say, I see what's happening. I see what's coming up. I may feel grief for this person, right? And I just need to see what that is and see what's going on and not make that about my story about myself. So it would be easy, and I think people in caregiving professions and human service professions at some point probably all go through that. I see this suffering every day. Compassion fatigue, I think is what they call it, right? I see this suffering every day. How do I stay upright in the midst of this, because I feel for all these people. It's an interesting piece of our practice, right? So I agree with you. It's not about sort of all the attachments go out the window, but how do we handle them carefully? How do we handle them skillfully? And then use our ability to, this is identity action, right? How do we use our ability to identify with someone who's suffering in order to actually help? It's not easy sometimes. So that was real bodhisattva work you were doing. Clearly. Other things folks would like to say about nyoho, dharma of thusness, please.
I was thinking about the recognizing things that you get attached to. And as an autistic person, I get attached to non-tangible things quite a bit. Routines, certain ways of doing things, and so on and so forth. And part of dealing with that is recognizing that to a certain extent, I'm always going to be like that. That's just how my brain's wired. But it doesn't necessarily have to affect how I respond to it.
Yeah, you have agency, right? You can make some choices. And until we see that that's part of our life, we just feel like we're at the mercy of stuff. And we all feel like that. It's not just you, right? We all feel we feel like evil is coming over the hill, suffering is coming over the hill, and somehow we don't have any control over that. Well, the good news is the Buddha woke up under a tree and said, guess what? Suffering has a cause. This is why cause and effect is so important in our tradition, right? Suffering has a cause. We can look at the cause and say, maybe there's something we can do about the cause. It might not eliminate my suffering, but it might shift it. It might change it. It might ameliorate it. And there are things I can do with this body and mind to actually make that concrete, right? So, you may have routines that you like and that stabilize your life and that make you feel sort of comfortable. And it sounds like you have enough self-awareness to know that's a routine. It serves me in a certain way. If something has to change, I have agency around that.
Right.
I don't have to sort of be at the mercy of that and kind of completely get tossed away. Part of our practice is seeing that clearly.
Right.
This is a complex piece of machinery, right? It takes a long time to really what is really going on here? And where am I creating suffering for myself? And can I do something else? And sometimes yes.
Sometimes yes.
Sometimes yes.
No.
And when not, then, we have to say it wasn't possible. That's what vow and repentance is about, right? That's why these things are always together. We're never going to make it perfect.
What?
That doesn't mean we don't act, right? We can't fall into, I can't do anything because I can't do everything. We have to do the best we can in this moment And in the next moment, vow and repentance and vow and repentance, right? Okay, my practice is not complete. In the next moment, I do it again.
Right.
Other things in this room?
Plus, just one real brief thing. I had not thought about this before, not in a nyoho way, but words,
Yeah.
right? Like saying the right amount, saying the appropriate thing, and not just serving my own ego, like, oh, look at how smart I am or whatever. But, but having an economy there and saying,
Yeah.
I can overspend this thing. I've dug myself out of many holes that this thing got me into, my whole life. So, yeah, that's an interesting perspective.
Well, and that's a great example of how, we start with food, clothing, and shelter, and we get really comfortable with nyoho around that, and then we go, okay, what else? What else? What else? What else? Am I talking too much? Am I buying too much? Am I not buying enough? Whatever that is, right? We get to do this. So we get this, at some point I'm probably going to put in front of you a 9-patch chart that has, food, clothing, and shelter, and taishiki, and where do these things, color, materials, and amount, and how do these things intersect? And then, how do we take that even bigger? Because the food, clothing, and shelter are sort of accessible dharma gates, but then what about language? What about work? What about ritual? What about other things? I think there's just so much interesting stuff we're going to run into this year, right? That's why I want everybody dogpiling on it. Because we're all going to see some other way that this applies, and I just think that's really cool. Because I think for a lot of folks, we encounter nyoho when we so raksu, and that's as far as we ever go. And that's not anybody's fault. It's just that's where the conversation has ended. And, with our Sanshin practice, we really deeply get into the food piece of that. And I got to say, that's probably my fault, because I was deeply into the food piece of that. And I kind of handed it off, right? So there's another opportunity. I just think we never sort of get the chance to say, what else is in there? It goes beyond how do I soto raksu. It's our whole approach to practice. So I just think there's tons of interesting opportunities there. That's one. And I think we'll see lots of them. So this is, at the end of the year, I would love to have a big parking lot that said, here are all the things we applied this to, and that's pretty cool. And by the way, I think this is not a 1-year conversation. I hope this is going on 12 years from now, because I just think there's so much dharma in there we get to noodle on. You look puzzled.
No, I'm not puzzled. I'm not.
Or
puzzled
thoughtful,
at all.
maybe.
I mean, I guess there's, a little bit of thoughtfulness, and just in the sense that, I just know I have so many attachments that are somehow causing suffering in some ways that I'll never be able to. Just because,
Welcome to the human
I
life.
know, and I like those attachments. Actually, I don't want to get rid of them, even though
Yeah,
it
just
is
need to see them
causing
clearly.
suffering. But even there, this. Even the kind of sewing of the raksu was kind of a test for me, just because after I sewed the raksu, it got lost for 1.5 years, and
did.
I was very much in that kind of space, but I sewed that raksu. I'm walking in, and I don't have this raksu. And then there's very much this one of people says oh, but this is because it is so important. No, it's not. It's there's this part that's very much this reflection on my own personal ego, and it's something that you can see right as it's happening. Just as all my other attachments in the world, I can see them right as they're happening, and I still do them anyway. And I kind of felt that's some of those ways which before I got into this practice, I was just kind of stumbling into walls all the time, and now I find myself just walking soberly into them. I don't know, maybe that's just a phase that you go through.
Well, I think that's a great example of why food, clothing, and shelter are wonderful places to sort of begin this practice, because they will reflect very quickly back to us what our practice is doing, right? In the way that more abstract things like words or ideas or something won't immediately. So if you're not handling your irritable carefully, you will fall and spill soup down yourself. Done it. If you're not paying attention, then things happen quite immediately. You go, oh, wait a minute, I wasn't paying attention. So my hope is that these concrete things are kind of reflecting back the larger things. They're not separate, it's just a gateway in there. So often for people, Raksu is the first experience of this that's just in your face all the time. And then you get to put it on every day, and it's still in front. You get to receive that every day, and it's still in front of you, right? So I think these things are really interesting dharma gates. Other things in the room? Sawyer, anybody at home that you can see? You can call on folks on my behalf. questions, reflections, nyoho, food, clothing, shelter, reusing, humble origins. Anything else people want to comment on today?
Nobody?
Okay,
Yes, I can add one thing.
please.
Which has to do with, well, kind of that humility aspect, which is an interesting thing to walk with. And the phrase just kind of came up in my mind that one of the things that this kind of practice does is it keeps us grounded, particularly thinking about things and acting in terms of nyoho. There's a kind of because it's tangible, it keeps us from just thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this other aspect, like when we talk about using what's around, using what's available, reusing what's available, which is, and literally using things from our own ground. And then I even relate that down to kind of the simplest nyoho practice maybe is Zazen.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like on the ground.
Yes.
In a very tangible way. It's also on the ground in an ultimate way. And it's completely nothing extra. It's sort of, there is nowhere else to bring something in. You know, it's just sitting is, you know, we say we only do those 4 things: taking a posture, breathing, eyes open, and letting go. It's like that's almost the simplest thing that you can do.
Yes. And you're using what you have in order to
And
do
you're
that.
using just your body and mind.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's all.
And yet you're not cut off from anything in the entire universe. So this kind of like, sort of like seeing that Zazen is a very direct manifestation of this kind of.
Yeah.
You know, you could look at it in terms of colors, materials.
You can.
Probably.
Well, you can. And that's what's interesting is you can use that framework and look at anything and go, oh, that's how this thing is nyoho. I think you make a great point because, again, it's like really showing how this is the underpinning, or this is not the underpinning, but this is not different or another layer. This is really right in the midst of our practice, right? This is like how we describe it. I mean, Toto-san's made the point that, you know, Buddha spent his whole life on the ground. He was born on the ground, he sat on the ground, died on the ground, he practiced on the ground, he walked everywhere, spent his whole life on the ground. So we might think, oh, Buddha's this abstract thing. Well, absolute, maybe. But, you know, there was a guy who lived on the ground. And, you know, it's very concrete in that way. So I think it's a great point, and I certainly don't want to lose track of, this is, again, one of the things I hope we explore this year. What is this connection? Nyoho and Zazen, Nyoho and work, Nyoho and ritual, right? Nyoho and study. Speaking, I mean, right? I just think there's so many interesting intersections there. So I'm talking about, you know, cups and robes and buildings, but I'm not talking about Zazen. So thank you for bringing that back together.
Yeah.
I saw somebody had a camera go on. I just want to make sure we didn't lose somebody who had something to say.
I think Claude has.
Oh, Claude Emile, please. And Claude Emile, I need to apologize for last time getting your name wrong at least 3 times. I think it was during Rakufatsu. Please pardon me.
Thank you very much. Then according to my own work and according to what you said, can we say the work is more with the attachment than the desire?
Well, so I think sometimes we lump those things together, right? Attachment and desire. So I think there's a couple of, when it comes to nyoho, there's a couple of ways we can look at that. If we're creating something, are we putting some intention into creating something which is not so likely to make our Dharma friends want to grab it, want to grasp it, want to own it, right? We can do that in the way that we create something or the way that we offer something. And then when it comes to our own practice, we can look at our own attachment and say, am I writing stories about this object? Am I creating self-image around this object, right? Am I Am I creating, because, you know, it really doesn't matter what that object is. We can create desire around it, because as I say, we can turn our virtues into hindrances. So there's a piece that says I have to take responsibility for my own attachment and my own practice and my own sort of greed, anger, and ignorance, right? But I just think it's really interesting when we look at the creation of things, which is kind of the other side. How can we create things and put things into the world with some intention about supporting other people not to grasp, right? And that's not a piece we often necessarily talk about, unless we're like making food for Sanshin or sowing a road, right? How do we put something into the world that doesn't encourage other people to break a precept, or to create attachment, or to do something unskillful, right? So it's another side to it, which I think is really kind of interesting. I'm not sure I've answered your question, Claude Emile. Do you have something else you'd like to say?
My own experience is desire is a part of life. It's my relation with the world. But if I'm attached to this desire, then I create more suffering.
Yeah.
If I'm in a position where desire comes and goes without grasping or trying to not grasping, then the level of tension and suffer is less. I think it was more in this way I would like to have your point of
Yeah.
view, the view of others. Thank you.
Yeah, so, yeah, there is a piece there about I feel some desire for something and do I act on it or not, right? So I can feel some pull towards something and do I act on it or not? And of course, if we're just operating by habitual thinking, I see this thing and I immediately go after it. I immediately start chasing it and creating suffering and clinging and all kinds of things, right? If I'm sitting zazen, or if I'm at least able to take a breath, do I see that coming up? And then can I make a skillful choice about I'm going to grasp that or I'm not going to grasp that? So there's a little gap there, there's a little space there if we're looking clearly, you know, if prajna is in front of us and we're looking clearly and saying, I feel some pull to this thing, but I have agency, right? I don't have to grab that thing. I don't have to create that suffering. I don't have to set up that kind of unwholesome dynamic. So in the beginning of our practice, I think we don't see that we can create that little bit of space. And the more that we practice and sit zazen and sort of open the hand and drop our preconception, we can see that we do have some choice, right? This is not suffering that's being piled on us from somewhere else. It's all coming from our own karmic action with this body and mind. So can we head off a little bit of that suffering, right? I hope that's where we're moving, right?
Well, then there's some reflection on whether it's wholesome or unwholesome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, why would I want to get rid of any wholesome desire?
Well, and that's the thing. So, you know, we look at the three poisons, greed, anger, and ignorance, and we can say, well, that's all evil stuff. But then we have to look at the other side. The other side of greed is generosity. You know, the other side of anger is sort of wanting to change the things in the world that are toxic, you know. So ignorance, we can say there's ignorance like I don't know about things, and then there's ignorance that says I'm choosing not to make a distinction. So how can we turn things around and say greed can be greed for a wholesome outcome of, you know, peace and joy for everybody in the world? We need some direction, we need some orientation, we need some motivation, otherwise we won't do anything. But is that about my self-clinging? Is that about if I get a good outcome here that makes me somebody, right? So yeah, we don't want to give up our aspiration. We can look at aspiration as a sort of clinging and greed, right? We don't want to give up our aspiration, but can we work with it skillfully? Yeah, I agree with you. Other things anywhere today, here or at home? They good for now? Okay, so you're going to see more and more information about nyoho basics on the website as time goes on. I'm going to start collecting up some of these things. We're also going to do a workshop on this weekend of January 25 and 26, and I hope people will make some effort to be there because that will be another good foundational piece going forward into 25. So this conversation is not over, and I am not the one with all the answers, so I'm really hoping this becomes an investigation for the community, and we'll see where we go with it. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Let's do our closing chant, and we will move into our memorial service for Sawaki Roshi today.